The morning sun barely touched the horizon when Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres checked her rifle for the third time. Every piece of equipment had to be perfect. There was no room for mistakes in her line of work. As one of only 12 female snipers in the entire Navy SEAL program, she carried more than just her weapon. She carried the hopes and doubts of everyone who questioned whether women belonged in America's most elite fighting force. Rachel had earned her place through blood, sweat, and more pain than most people could imagine. The training that broke grown men had only made her stronger. When other candidates quit during Hell Week, she kept going. When instructors screamed in her face, trying to break her will, she stared back with steel in her eyes. She didn't just want to be a SEAL, she needed to prove that she belonged there. The mission briefing had been crystal clear. Intelligence had tracked a high-value target to a compound in hostile territory. This wasn't just any target. Hassan al-Rashid was responsible for coordinating attacks that had killed dozens of American soldiers over the past year. He was smart, careful, and had avoided capture for months. But today, intelligence said he would be in that compound. Today was their chance. Rachel's team had been planning this operation for weeks. Every detail had been studied, every angle calculated. She knew the compound's layout better than her own apartment. She had memorized the faces of everyone who lived there, studied their daily routines, and identified all possible escape routes. The mission was personal for her team. They had lost friends to al-Rashid's bombs. As the team prepared to move out, Rachel felt the familiar mix of nerves and excitement. This was what she lived for. All those years of training, all those sleepless nights studying enemy tactics, all those hours on the shooting range, it all led to moments like this. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She was a weapon, carefully crafted and precisely aimed. The journey to the target location took 3 hours through rough terrain. Rachel's team moved like shadows, communicating through hand signals and whispered RADIO calls. They had done this dance hundreds of times before. Each member knew their role perfectly. Rachel's job was to provide overwatch, to be the guardian angel watching over her teammates from a distance. Setting up her position took another hour. Every detail mattered. The angle of the sun, the direction of the wind, the distance to the target, all of it had to be calculated perfectly. Rachel found her spot on a ridge overlooking the compound, exactly 847 meters away. It was a challenging shot, but well within her capabilities. She had hit targets at twice that distance during training. Through her scope, Rachel could see the compound clearly. It looked exactly like the intelligence photos, but something felt different. There was more activity than expected. People were moving around, going about their daily business. Women hanging laundry, children playing in the courtyard, men working on vehicles. It looked like a normal family compound, not a terrorist hideout. Rachel's radio crackled softly. Overwatch, this is team leader. Target confirmed on location. Positive ID on Hassan al-Rashid. You have green light for the shot. Rachel adjusted her scope and found the target. There he was, Hassan al-Rashid, walking across the compound's main courtyard. He looked exactly like his photos. Same height, same build, same distinctive scar across his left cheek. Intelligence had been right. He was here, and he was exposed, but something made Rachel pause. The man in her crosshairs was talking to what looked like family members. A woman who might be his wife, children who could be his sons and daughters. They were laughing about something, acting like any normal family would on a peaceful morning. For a moment, Rachel wondered about the lives that would be shattered by her next action. The radio crackled again. Overwatch, do you have the shot? Rachel pushed her doubts aside. This was Hassan al-Rashid, a man responsible for the deaths of American soldiers. Her friends had died because of his actions. The mission was clear, the target was confirmed, and her orders were direct. She had trained for this moment her entire career. Positive, Rachel replied quietly. I have the shot. Her finger found the trigger. Years of training took over. Breathe in, breathe out, find the natural pause between heartbeats. The world around her seemed to slow down. The wind, the distance, The target's movement, everything came together in a moment of perfect calculation. The shot was perfect. Rachel watched through her scope as Hassan al-Rashid dropped to the ground. The compound erupted in chaos. People screamed and ran for cover. The mission was complete. The target was down, but then something went wrong. Horribly wrong. Within minutes, Rachel's radio exploded with frantic communications. Local media was reporting civilian casualties. Videos were already appearing online showing the aftermath of the shooting. The carefully planned operation was turning into a public relations nightmare. Rachel watched in horror as rescue workers arrived at the compound. They were carrying bodies, including what looked like children. The videos being broadcast showed grieving families, blood in the courtyard, and chaos where there should have been tactical precision. How is this possible? Rachel whispered to herself. Her shot had been perfect. She had hit exactly who she was supposed to hit. But the videos told a different story. The enemy's propaganda machine worked faster than anyone had expected. Within hours, the story was spreading across social media and international news outlets. American sniper kills innocent family. Military operation goes wrong. Civilian casualties in failed raid. The headlines wrote themselves, and none of them were kind to Rachel or her team. Back at base, Rachel tried to piece together what had happened. The intelligence had been solid. The target identification had been confirmed by multiple sources. She had followed her orders exactly, but the evidence was mounting against her. Videos, photos, and witness testimonies all painted a picture of a military operation that had gone terribly wrong. The investigation began immediately. Rachel found herself answering the same questions over and over again. What did you see? Who gave you the order to shoot? Are you certain it was Hassan al-Rashid? The questions came from military investigators, intelligence officers, and eventually lawyers. Rachel's teammates tried to support her, but they were dealing with their own investigations. The entire operation was being torn apart, examined piece by piece. Every decision, every communication, every moment of the mission was under scrutiny. Days turned into weeks, and the international pressure continued to build. Foreign governments demanded answers. Human rights organizations called for investigations. The media painted Rachel as either a hero or a villain. Depending on which news channel you watched. Through it all, Rachel maintained her innocence. She had followed her training, followed her orders, and done exactly what she was supposed to do. The target had been confirmed, the shot had been authorized, and she had executed the mission flawlessly. But in the court of public opinion, none of that seemed to matter. The woman who had worked so hard to prove that she belonged among America's elite warriors now found herself at the center of an international incident. The mission that should have been the highlight of her career had become the beginning of her worst nightmare. As Rachel sat in her quarters, cleaning her rifle one more time, she couldn't have imagined how much worse things were about to get. The investigation was just beginning, and the people who had sent her on this mission were already looking for someone to blame. The knock on Rachel's door came at 5 a.m, 3 weeks after the mission. She had been expecting it, but that didn't make it any easier. Through the peephole, she could see 2 military police officers and a man in a dark suit. Her heart sank. This was it. The moment she had been dreading since the investigation began. "Chief Petty Officer Torres, you need to come with us," the lead officer said when she opened the door. His voice was professional but not unkind. Rachel could see in his eyes that he didn't enjoy this part of his job. Rachel had always imagined that if she were ever arrested, she would feel angry or defiant. Instead, she felt hollow, empty, like someone had reached inside her chest and stolen something vital. She had given everything to the Navy, sacrificed relationships and opportunities, pushed her body and mind to their absolute limits. And now that same Navy was turning its back on her. The ride to the military courthouse felt like it lasted forever. Rachel stared out the window at the base she had called home for years. The buildings looked the same, but everything felt different. Now, soldiers she passed on the street either stared at her with curiosity or looked away entirely. Word traveled fast in the military, and everyone knew why she was in that car. The charges were read in a sterile conference room. That smelled like old coffee and fear, murder, violation of the laws of war, conduct unbecoming an officer. Each word hit Rachel like a physical blow. She had spent her entire career following orders, protecting her country, and doing her job with precision and honor. Now she was being accused of being a war criminal. "Do you understand these charges?" the legal officer asked. Rachel nodded, not trusting her voice. She understood the charges, but she didn't understand how her life had fallen apart so quickly. 3 weeks ago, she had been one of the Navy's most decorated snipers. Today, she was sitting in handcuffs, facing life in prison. The media circus began immediately. News vans lined up outside the base like vultures waiting for a meal. Rachel's photo was everywhere, on television and newspapers across social media. The headlines were brutal. Female SEAL sniper charged with murder. Military's first female war criminal. When training goes too far? Most of the coverage painted her as a rogue operator who had lost control. They talked about the pressure of being a woman in a man's world, suggesting that she had cracked under the stress. Some reporters dug into her background looking for signs of instability or aggression. They found old training videos where she looked fierce and determined, and used them to support their narrative of a soldier who had gone too far. Rachel's defense attorney was a tired-looking captain named David Chun. He had been assigned to her case, and Rachel could tell from their first meeting that he was overwhelmed. This wasn't just any case. It was an international incident with political implications that reached the highest levels of government. "The evidence against you is circumstantial," Chun explained during their first meeting, "but the political pressure is enormous. The Pentagon needs someone to blame for this mess, and unfortunately, you're the most convenient target." Rachel learned that several key pieces of evidence had been classified as too sensitive for public trial. The mission briefing that had authorized her actions was locked away in a secure vault. The intelligence reports that had confirmed Hassan al-Rashid's identity were deemed too sensitive to share. Even the radio communications from the day of the mission had been classified. "How can they try me without the evidence that proves my innocence?" Rachel asked. Chun shrugged helplessly. "National security trumps individual rights in military court. They can classify whatever they want to protect ongoing operations." The prosecution, led by an ambitious colonel named Patricia Williams, had a different story to tell. According to Williams, Rachel had acted outside her authority, taking a shot without proper confirmation of the target's identity. She painted Rachel as a sniper who had become too comfortable with killing, too eager to pull the trigger. Williams was smart and ruthless. She had built her career on high-profile cases, and Rachel's trial was her chance to make it to the generals' stars. She knew exactly how to play to the media and the international community. Her narrative was simple and compelling. A soldier had broken the rules, and innocent people had died as a result. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the aftermath. Videos and testimonies from local witnesses. They showed the court footage of crying families, damaged buildings, and what appeared to be civilian casualties. The images were powerful and heartbreaking. Rachel had to sit in court every day, watching video of the destruction that had followed her shot. What made it worse was that Rachel's own commanding officers remained silent. The men who had sent her on the mission, who had confirmed the target, who had given her the green light to shoot, they were nowhere to be found. They had been transferred to other assignments or were suddenly too busy to testify. The chain of command that should have protected her had melted away like snow in summer. Rachel's teammates wanted to help, but they were forbidden from speaking about the classified mission. Master Chief Rodriguez, who had been monitoring the radio communications that day, was deployed overseas just weeks before the trial. Sergeant Johnson, who had helped identify the target, was suddenly assigned to a training facility in Alaska. One by one, everyone who could have supported Rachel's version of events disappeared. The loneliness was the worst part. Rachel had spent her career surrounded by teammates who would die for each other. Now she sat alone in a military courtroom, facing a system that seemed determined to destroy her. Her family visited when they could, but they didn't understand. the military world, or the complexities of what had happened. They loved her, but they couldn't help her. Rachel's mother cried every time she visited. "I don't understand how this happened," she would say. "You've always been such a good person. You joined the military to serve your country." Rachel didn't have good answers for her mother. She didn't understand it either. She had followed her training, followed her orders, and done exactly what she was supposed to do. But somehow, she had become the villain in a story that was much bigger than one sniper and one shot. The international pressure continued to build throughout the trial. Foreign governments demanded justice for the civilian casualties. Human rights organizations called for Rachel to be made an example of. The media coverage was relentless, with news stories every day about the American sniper who had gone too far. Rachel realized that her trial wasn't really about justice. It was about politics and public relations. The Pentagon needed to show the world that America held its soldiers accountable. They needed someone to blame for a mission that had gone wrong in the most public way possible. And Rachel, as the person who had pulled the trigger, was the perfect scapegoat. As the trial dragged on, Rachel watched her life being dissected and destroyed piece by piece. Her service record, which had been exemplary, was re-examined and questioned. Her psychological evaluations were scrutinized for signs of instability. Her relationships with her teammates were analyzed for evidence of poor judgment. The prosecution painted her as a soldier who had become too comfortable with violence, too eager to kill. They suggested that the pressure of being a woman in a male-dominated field had warped her judgment. They claimed that she had been trying to prove herself by taking unnecessary risks. Rachel sat in that courtroom every day, watching her life being rewritten by lawyers and politicians who had never been in combat, never held a rifle, never had to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. They were turning her into a monster, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The woman who had once been one of America's most elite warriors was now fighting the most important battle of her life, and she was losing. The final day of the trial arrived with the kind of gray, overcast sky that seemed to match Rachel's mood. She had been sitting in that courtroom for 3 months, watching her life being torn apart piece by piece. Every morning she put on her dress uniform and tried to maintain the dignity of a Navy SEAL. Every evening, she returned to her cell feeling a little more broken than the day before. Rachel's defense attorney, Captain Chun, had done his best with an impossible situation. But how do you defend someone when all the evidence that could prove their innocence is locked away in classified files? How do you fight a system that needs you to be guilty more than it needs you to be innocent? The deck is stacked against U.S., Chin had told her the night before. But we've presented everything we could. The jury will have to decide if they believe the prosecution's version of events or if they have reasonable doubt. Rachel appreciated Chun's efforts, but she could see the writing on the wall. The prosecution had built a compelling case around the visible evidence, the videos of civilian casualties, the testimonies from local witnesses, the international outrage. Her defense relied on classified information that the jury would never see, and testimonies from teammates who had been conveniently reassigned. The courtroom was packed for the final arguments. Military officers, journalists, and even some family. Members of the alleged victims had traveled from overseas to watch the proceedings. Rachel could feel their eyes on her, judging her, waiting for justice to be served. She wondered if any of them cared about the truth or if they just wanted someone to blame. Colonel Williams, the prosecutor, delivered her closing argument with the skill of someone who had been preparing for this moment her entire career. She painted Rachel as a soldier who had forgotten the rules of engagement, who had become too eager to kill, too comfortable with violence. "Members of the jury," Williams said, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "the evidence is clear." Chief Petty Officer Torres took a shot without proper authorization, without confirming the target's identity, and as a result, innocent people died. This is not about politics or international pressure. This is about a soldier who broke the rules and must face the consequences. Williams showed the jury the aftermath videos one more time. The images were devastating. Families crying over their loved ones, children running in terror, blood on the ground where Rachel's bullet had found its mark. The prosecutor was smart enough to let the images speak for themselves. The defendant wants you to believe that she was following orders, Williams continued. But where are those orders? Where is the documentation? Where are the witnesses who can confirm her story? The truth is, there is no evidence to support her claims because those claims are false. Rachel watched the jury's faces as Williams spoke. These were military officers who understood the importance of following orders and rules of engagement. They had seen the videos, heard the testimonies, and been presented with a clear narrative of a soldier who had gone too far, without access to the classified evidence. They had no reason to doubt the prosecution's version of events. Captain Chun's closing argument was passionate but hollow. He talked about Rachel's service record, her years of exemplary performance, her dedication to her country. He pointed out the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case and the convenient disappearance of key witnesses. But his words felt like whispers in a hurricane. Chief Petty Officer Torres is not the monster the prosecution wants you to believe she is, Chun argued. She's a dedicated soldier who followed her training and her orders. The real tragedy here is not just the loss of innocent life, but the scapegoating of a woman who devoted her life to serving her country. Chun's words were true, but truth and justice don't always go hand in hand. Rachel could see that the jury had already made up their minds. They needed to believe that the system worked, that soldiers who crossed the line would be held accountable. Her guilt was necessary for their peace of mind. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Rachel spent that time in a holding cell, staring at the concrete walls and trying to prepare herself for what was coming. She thought about her childhood, about the dreams she had once had, about the life she might have lived if she had chosen a different path. She remembered the day she had first decided to join the military. She had been watching the news about a terrorist attack, feeling helpless and angry. She had wanted to do something, to make a difference, to protect people. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now being convicted of the very thing she had joined the military to prevent. When the jury returned, Rachel could read the verdict in their faces before the judge spoke a single word. They looked at her with a mixture of sadness and resolve. They didn't hate her, but they believed she was guilty. They believed the story they had been told. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "We have, Your Honor," the jury foreman replied. He was a lieutenant colonel with 20 years of service, a man who had probably sent soldiers into harm's way himself. His voice was steady, but not unkind. "On the charge of murder, how do you find?" "Guilty, Your Honor." The word hit Rachel like a physical blow. She had been expecting it, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that preparation couldn't soften. She felt her knees go weak, but she forced herself to remain standing. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. "On the charge of violation of the laws of war, how do you find?" "Guilty, Your Honor." "On the charge of conduct unbecoming an officer, how do you find?" "Guilty, Your Honor." 3 words. 3 simple words that destroyed everything Rachel had worked for, everything she had sacrificed for, everything she had believed in. She was no longer Chief Petty Officer Torres, decorated sniper and elite warrior. She was now a convicted war criminal. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following week, but everyone in the courtroom knew what was coming. The prosecution had asked for life in prison, and given the international attention the case had received, the judge would have to impose a harsh sentence to satisfy the demands for justice. Rachel's mother was in the courtroom that day, sitting in the gallery with tears streaming down her face. She had flown in from California to watch her daughter's life be destroyed by a system she didn't understand. Rachel turned to look at her, trying to offer a reassuring smile, but she couldn't manage it. The media was already writing their stories before the judge had even dismissed the court. Female SEAL convicted of war crimes. Military justice served in controversial case. First woman SEAL found guilty of murder. The headlines would be brutal, but they would also be brief. The world would move on to the next story, but Rachel would carry this verdict for the rest of her life. As the bailiff led her away in handcuffs, Rachel thought about her teammates, the men and women she had served with, who had trusted her with their lives, who had seen her as an equal and a sister. What would they think now? Would they remember the soldier she had been, or would they only remember the criminal she had become? The prison transport van that took her back to her cell was the same one that had brought her to court every day for 3 months. The driver was a young soldier who had always been polite and respectful. Today he couldn't meet her eyes. In the rearview mirror, Rachel understood. She was no longer a fellow soldier. She was a convicted felon, a war criminal, a cautionary tale about what happens when training goes wrong. The system had worked exactly as it was designed to work. Someone had to be held accountable for the civilian casualties, and that someone was her. In her cell that night, Rachel stared at the ceiling and wondered if she would ever see freedom again. She thought about the shot that had changed everything, the perfect execution of a flawed mission. She had done everything right, but somehow everything had gone wrong. The woman who had once been one of America's most elite warriors was now facing life in prison, and there was nothing she could do to change it. Master Chief Tony Rodriguez couldn't sleep. It had been 6 months since Rachel's conviction, and every night he lay awake thinking about what had happened in that courtroom. He had served with Rachel for 3 years, had watched her back in some of the most dangerous places on earth, and had seen her make impossible shots that saved American lives. The woman who was now sitting in a military prison was not the war criminal the prosecution had painted her to be. Rodriguez was a 22-year veteran of the Navy SEALs, a man who had seen more combat than most soldiers could imagine. He had been in the radio room during Rachel's mission, had heard every communication, had been part of the chain of command that had authorized her shot. He knew the truth about what had happened that day, and the truth was eating him alive. The official story was that Rachel had acted on her own, without proper authorization, and had killed innocent civilians. But Rodriguez remembered the radio chatter differently. He remembered the intelligence briefing that had confirmed Hassan al-Rashid's presence at the compound. He remembered the urgent communications from field units requesting immediate action. Most importantly, he remembered giving Rachel the green light to take the shot. She was following orders, Rodriguez muttered to himself as he stared at the ceiling of his quarters. She was doing exactly what we trained her to do. The problem was that Rodriguez had been ordered to remain silent during the trial. The mission had been classified, and his testimony would have revealed sensitive intelligence methods. The brass had made it clear that national security was more important than one soldier's fate. Rodriguez had followed orders as he always did, but the weight of his silence was crushing him. Rodriguez wasn't the only one struggling with what had happened. Across the country, other members of Rachel's unit were dealing with their own guilt and frustration. Sergeant First Class Mike Chun had been the intelligence analyst who had identified the target. He knew that the identification had been solid, that multiple sources had confirmed al-Rashid's presence at the compound. But his reports had been classified, and he had been forbidden from testifying. Chun had tried to reach out to Rachel's defense team, but his commanding officer had shut him down immediately. "You don't exist as far as this trial is concerned," he had been told. "Your work is classified, and it stays classified." Chin had watched the trial coverage on the news, had seen Rachel being painted as a rogue operator who had acted without authorization. He had thrown his remote control at the television screen. When the prosecutor suggested that Rachel had been trying to prove herself by taking unnecessary risks, Chun knew better. He had seen Rachel's service record, had worked with her on multiple operations, and had witnessed her dedication to following proper procedures. Petty Officer First Class Lisa Park had been the communications specialist during the mission. She had been monitoring all radio traffic, had recorded every conversation, and had archived all the mission data. She knew that somewhere in a classified server there was audio evidence that would completely exonerate Rachel. But that evidence was locked away, deemed too sensitive for public consumption. Park had requested permission to testify, had even offered to have her testimony reviewed and censored to protect classified information, but her requests had been denied. The powers that be had decided that the mission details were too sensitive to reveal, even to save an innocent soldier's life. The frustration was building within the unit. These were elite warriors who had sworn an oath to leave no one behind, but they had been forced to watch one of their own be sacrificed for political convenience. The contradiction was tearing them apart. Rodriguez began reaching out to his former teammates, making quiet phone calls and sending carefully worded messages. He wasn't planning anything yet, but he needed to know if others were feeling the same way he was. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Everyone who had served with Rachel was struggling with what had happened. "It's not right, Tony," Chun told him during a secure phone call. "She's sitting in prison for following our orders. How do we live with that?" "I don't know," Rodriguez admitted. "But I know we can't just let it stand. She trusted us and we let her down." The conversations continued for weeks. Rodriguez connected with intelligence analysts, radio operators, field commanders, and support staff who had been involved in the mission. All of them had pieces of the puzzle, fragments of evidence that would have proven Rachel's innocence. But individually they were powerless to help her. Park had started making copies of relevant communications, carefully documenting everything she could remember about the mission. She knew that what she was doing was technically against regulations, but she also knew that regulations had been used to railroad an innocent soldier. "They classified everything that could have saved her," Park told Rodriguez during one of their meetings. "They made sure the jury never heard the real story." June had been doing his own research, looking into the political pressures that had shaped the trial. He had discovered that the Pentagon had been under enormous international pressure to show accountability for the civilian casualties. The administration needed a scapegoat, and Rachel had been the perfect candidate. This was never about justice, Chun realized. This was about politics. They needed someone to blame, and she was convenient. Rodriguez felt his anger growing with each revelation. He had dedicated his life to serving his country, had followed orders without question for over 2 decades. But watching Rachel be destroyed by the same system he had sworn to protect was changing something fundamental inside him, the breaking point came when Rodriguez received word that Rachel had been placed in solitary confinement after a fight with another prisoner. The official report claimed that she had become violent and unstable, that prison life was revealing her true nature. But Rodriguez knew Rachel. He knew that she was probably defending herself or protecting someone weaker, just as she had always done. That night, Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. He called Chun and Park, asking them to meet him at a secure location off base. When they arrived, they found Rodriguez with a stack of files and a look of determination they had never seen before. "I'm done watching her take the fall for something we all did," Rodriguez announced. "I'm done following orders that destroy innocent people. I'm done pretending that what happened to Rachel was justice." Chun and Park looked at each other, understanding immediately what Rodriguez was suggesting. They were talking about challenging the military justice system, about risking their own careers to save their teammate. It was unprecedented, dangerous, and potentially career-ending. "What are you thinking?" Park asked. "I'm thinking we gather everyone who was involved in that mission," Rodriguez replied. "I'm thinking we document everything we know, everything we remember, everything that was hidden from the court. And then we make some noise. They'll destroy us," Chun warned. "You know that, right? They'll court-martial all of us?" Rodriguez nodded grimly. "Maybe, but Rachel is already destroyed and she didn't deserve it. We took an oath to leave no one behind. That includes leaving no one behind in a prison cell for something they didn't do." The 3 of them spent the next several hours planning what would become one of the most unusual protests in military history. They would gather their evidence, reach out to their former teammates, and find a way to make the truth known. They would risk everything to save a fellow soldier who had been abandoned by the system they all served as they prepared to leave. That night, Park asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Do you really think we can make a difference?" Rodriguez looked at her with the same intensity he had shown in combat zones around the world. "I don't know if we can save her, but I know we have to try. Because if we don't, then everything we've fought for, everything we've believed in, is a lie." The wheels of justice had failed Rachel, but her teammates were about to discover that. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not against foreign enemies, but against the failures of the system you've sworn to protect. 2 years had passed since Rachel's conviction, and the world had mostly forgotten about the female SEAL sniper who had been sent to military prison. The news cycle had moved on to other stories, other scandals, other tragedies. But Master Chief Rodriguez and his team had never stopped working. They had spent months gathering evidence, documenting testimonies, and building a case that would challenge the most powerful military justice system in the world. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A former Pentagon insider named Dr. James Mitchell had grown tired of watching the truth be buried under layers of classification and political convenience. Mitchell had been part of the intelligence team that had provided the original target identification for Rachel's mission. He had watched the trial from afar. Knowing that he possessed documents that could prove her innocence, Mitchell reached out to Rodriguez through secure channels, offering to leak classified documents that showed the mission had been personally authorized by senior Pentagon officials. The documents included the original intelligence briefing, communication logs, and target confirmation reports that had been hidden from Rachel's defense team. "I've been carrying this guilt for 2 years," Mitchell told Rodriguez during their secret meeting in a downtown coffee shop. "I watched them destroy that woman for following orders that came from the highest levels of command. I can't live with it anymore." The leaked documents were a game changer. They showed that Rachel's mission had been carefully planned and authorized by officials at the Pentagon. The intelligence confirming Hassan al-Rashid's identity had been rock solid, verified by multiple sources. Most importantly, the documents proved that Rachel had acted exactly within her orders and rules of engagement. Rodriguez felt a mix of vindication and rage as he read through the classified files. Everything they had suspected was true. Rachel had been made a scapegoat for a mission that had gone exactly as planned. The only thing that had gone wrong was the political fallout, and rather than defend their soldier, the Pentagon had thrown her under the bus. "This is it," Rodriguez told his team during their next meeting. "This is what we need to clear her name." But having the evidence was only half the battle. They needed to figure out how to get it to the right people without all of them ending up in prison for handling classified materials. They needed a plan that would force the military justice system to reopen Rachel's case. The plan they developed was audacious and dangerous. Rodriguez would gather as many of Rachel's former teammates as possible and march into the Pentagon demanding a meeting with the highest-ranking officials. They would present their evidence publicly, making it impossible for the military to ignore or suppress the truth. Rodriguez began reaching out to every member of Rachel's unit he could find. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Despite the risks to their own careers, soldier after soldier agreed to join the protest. They had all been living with the guilt of Rachel's conviction, and they were ready to risk everything to make it right. Sergeant Chun took leave from his current assignment in Germany to fly back to the United States. Petty Officer Park requested emergency leave to participate in what she called a family emergency. One by one, Rachel's former teammates began converging on Washington, D.C., ready to make a stand that could end their military careers. The night before their planned protest, Rodriguez gathered his team in a hotel conference room near the Pentagon. 15 Navy SEALs sat around the table, each one knowing that tomorrow could be the end of their military service. These were men and women who had dedicated their lives to following orders, and now they were preparing to directly challenge their chain of command. "I want everyone to understand what we're doing tomorrow," Rodriguez said, looking each person in the eye. "We're not just risking our careers, we're risking court-martial, prison time, and dishonor. If anyone wants to walk away, now is the time." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody walked away. The next morning, 15 Navy SEALs, dressed in their full dress uniforms, marched up to the main entrance of the Pentagon. They carried with them copies of the leaked documents, testimonies from their fellow soldiers, and a demand for justice that had been 2 years in the making. The sight of decorated, Navy SEALs demanding entry to challenge the military justice. System sent shockwaves through the Pentagon. Security officers didn't know how to handle the situation. These weren't protesters or activists. These were some of the military's most elite warriors, demanding accountability from their own leadership. Rodriguez stepped forward as the group's spokesperson. "We request an immediate meeting with the Secretary of Defense," he announced in a voice that carried across the Pentagon's entrance plaza. "We have evidence that proves Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres was wrongfully convicted, and we demand that her case be reopened immediately." News of the protests spread through the Pentagon like wildfire. Within hours, journalists were arriving at the scene. Social media exploded with images of the SEALs standing in formation outside the Pentagon. The story that the military had hoped would stay buried was suddenly front-page news again. The Pentagon brass found themselves in an impossible situation. They couldn't simply arrest 15 decorated Navy SEALs without creating an even bigger scandal, but they also couldn't ignore the challenge to their authority. The standoff continued for hours, with the SEALs refusing to leave until they were heard. Finally, General Patricia Wilson, the Pentagon's top legal officer, agreed to meet with Rodriguez and 2 other representatives. The meeting was tense and formal, with lawyers and senior officials on one side and 3 Navy SEALs on the other. Rodriguez presented the leaked documents methodically, explaining how each piece of evidence proved Rachel's innocence. He showed the original mission authorization, the target confirmation reports, and the communication logs that had been hidden from the trial. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. "This woman followed orders," Rodriguez said firmly. "She did exactly what she was trained to do, what she was told to do, and what her country asked her to do. And you destroyed her life to cover up a political mess." General Wilson reviewed the documents with growing concern. She could see immediately that the evidence would completely exonerate Rachel. More importantly, she could see that the military's handling of the case had been a catastrophic failure of justice. "Where did you get these classified documents?" Wilson asked. "That's not important," Rodriguez replied. "What's important is that an innocent soldier is sitting in prison while the people who sent her there walk free." The meeting lasted for 3 hours, with Pentagon officials frantically consulting with lawyers and senior leadership. Meanwhile, outside the building, the other SEALs continued their vigil, drawing more and more media attention with each passing hour. The pressure became too much for the Pentagon to ignore. Within a week, the Secretary of Defense announced that Rachel's case would be reviewed by an independent panel. The leaked documents forced a complete reinvestigation of the mission and the trial that had followed. The reinvestigation moved quickly once it began. Faced with irrefutable evidence of Rachel's innocence, the Pentagon had no choice but to acknowledge the massive failure of justice. The officials who had covered up the truth faced their own investigations. The prosecutors who had built their careers on Rachel's conviction found themselves under scrutiny. 6 months after the SEALs' protest, Rachel walked out of military prison a free woman. All charges against her were dropped, her rank was restored, and she received a formal apology from the Secretary of the Navy. The Pentagon also announced new policies to prevent classified evidence from being withheld in future court-martial proceedings. The reunion between Rachel and her team was emotional and powerful. These warriors who had sworn to leave no one behind had kept their promise, even when it meant risking everything they had worked for. They had proven that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against foreign enemies, but against injustice within your own ranks. Rachel's case became a landmark example of how political pressure could corrupt military justice, but also how the bonds forged in combat could overcome even institutional failure. The SEALs, who had stood outside the Pentagon that day, had reminded everyone that honor and loyalty sometimes required disobeying orders and challenging authority. As Rachel returned to active duty, she carried with her the knowledge that she had been served by teammates who valued truth and justice more than their own careers. The woman who had once been abandoned by the system had been saved by the very warriors she had served alongside. It was a reminder that in the end, the most important Victories are won not on foreign battlefields but in the pursuit of truth and the protection of those who serve.